Before the European Union, before the great trading blocs of the modern world, there was the Hanseatic League, a network of 200 cities that controlled trade across the Baltic and North Seas for 400 years. From London to Novgorod, from Bergen to Bruges, the merchants of the Hansa dominated the commerce of Northern Europe. They built the ships, set the prices, and wrote the rules. And they did it not through conquest, but through collective action. This is the story of the first trade union of cities, the Hanseatic League. This is Empires and Economics. To understand the Hanseatic League, you have to understand the Baltic. Today it is a quiet inland sea, but in the Middle Ages it was the engine of Northern Europe's economy, a cold sea of riches. Around its shores lay products that the rest of Europe desperately wanted. From the forests of the east came furs, wax, honey, and timber. From Scandinavia came copper and iron. From the salt works of the German north came salt, the preservative that kept food edible through the long winter. And from the rivers of the deep interior came grain, the true wealth of the age. The problem was distribution. The Baltic shores were fragmented among dozens of small kingdoms, tribal territories, and competing lords. No single power could organize the trade, so the merchants organized it themselves. The first Hansa was not a league of cities at all, it was a league of merchants. In the 12th century, German merchants began traveling eastward, following the expanding trade routes of the Baltic. They formed associations for protection and mutual aid called Hansas, an old German word meaning a troop or company. When a merchant traveled abroad, he expected to find his countrymen with a shared set of rights and privileges. The early center of this trade was the island of Gotland and its port of Visby, a free trading city where merchants from all over the Baltic met, pooled their cargoes, and marched together into the eastern markets. But the city that would come to rule the Hansa rose a little to the south, on the banks of the Trev River, where it meets the Baltic. That city is Lübeck. Founded in 1159 by Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, Lübeck was built with a single purpose: trade. Its merchant elite controlled the city government. Its harbor was protected from the sea, and its position on the land bridge between the Baltic and the North Sea gave it command of the two great currents of northern commerce. More than any other city, Lübeck became the queen of the Hansa. German merchants abroad were known as Lübeckers even when they were not. Lübeck's law became the law of trade in dozens of Baltic cities, from Riga to Tallinn. When the League needed a capital, Lübeck provided it. By the 13th century, the merchant associations had grown into something much larger. Hundreds of city governments, from the Rhine in the west to Estonia in the east, shared the same trading law, the same currency zones, and the same privileges in foreign ports. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, they began to act together, negotiating as a bloc, imposing embargoes, and pursuing common commercial policy. The Hanseatic League was born, not from a treaty or a constitution, but from a shared interest in trade. It had no head of state, no standing army, no parliament. What it had was a common purpose: to protect the merchant's profit. At the heart of the League's wealth was a humble fish, the herring. Every autumn the herring returned to the Baltic in staggering numbers, schools so vast they silvered the sea. The greatest fishery lay off the coast of Scania, in what is now southern Sweden. There, at the peninsula of Skanor and Falsterbo, fishing communities gathered by the thousands, and the merchants of the Hansa were waiting. The catch was preserved in salt, and the League controlled the salt as well. Salt from the great mine at Leuenberg, refined at Lübeck, was shipped to Scania in endless cargoes. Salt met herring, the herring was barreled, and the barrels went out to feed the fasting tables and the salted diets of all Europe. The Scanian herring trade was the largest industry of northern Europe, and its profits flowed to the League. The church demanded fish on hundreds of fast days a year. The common folk needed preserved food for winter. Armies and navies needed rations that would not rot. Salted herring was the fuel of medieval commerce, and the Hansa controlled its production, its transport, and its price. The League guarded this trade fiercely. Merchant convoys sailed together for protection. Foreign traders were granted access only on the League's terms. Control of the herring trade alone was enough to make the Hansa the richest commercial enterprise of the medieval North. The ship of the Hansa was the cog, a sturdy, round-bellied vessel with a single square sail and high sides, built to carry heavy cargo across rough northern seas. The cog was the container ship of its age, boxy, reliable, and economical, able to carry 200 tons of cargo or more. A typical voyage joined a convoy for safety, and the League set the rules: standard weights, standard measures, standard quality. A barrel of herring from a Hanseatic city meant a barrel of true measure, or the merchant faced severe penalties at home. The brand of the Hansa was trust, and trust was the currency of trade. To trade across Europe, the League needed permanent bases abroad, fortified trading posts where its merchants could live, store their goods, and negotiate with the locals. These were the kontors. the League's overseas factories. The greatest stood at Novgorod, deep in the Russian interior, a city whose markets connected to the Silk Roads of the east and the fir forest of the north. The kontor of Peterhof was a self-governing merchant colony, a miniature Hanseatic city inside a Russian city, where trading followed the League's law, not the local lords. The Novgorod trade was starkly unequal. The Hansa sold to the Russians cloth, salt, wine, metals, and bought from them the true wealth of the north, furs, wax, and honey. No ship could pass without the League's merchants taking their share. At the other end of Europe, the kontor of Bergen controlled the Norwegian trade, the great cod fisheries of the north, dried and stock-fished, shipped south by the barrel. The wharf of Bergen, with its leaning timber warehouses, still stands today. The Bergen kontor enforced a strict monopoly. Norwegian fishermen had to sell their catch to the Hanseatic merchants at fixed prices, and Norwegian merchants were largely excluded from their own export trade. It was ruthless commercial colonialism, administered not by a king, but by a guild. The kontor of London, the famous steelyard, managed the League's trade in England. English wool went out by the bale, Flemish cloth came back. Hanseatic merchants enjoyed privileges granted by the English crown itself, exemption from tolls, rights to self-government, and monopoly over the trade through London. And in the great cloth city of Bruges, the League's fourth kontor linked the commerce of the Baltic to the trade of the entire south, the Mediterranean, the fairs of Champagne, the wool of England, the cloth of Flanders. Through these four kontors, the Hansa touched every corner of European trade. Now we come to the League's great innovation, collective action. When the League's merchants faced hostility abroad, the cities did not send armies, they sent embargoes. The tool was the trade blockade, called the kontor confiscation or the Verhensung. The League simply stopped trading with the offending power. City after city on the Baltic coast would close its ports, halt its convoys, and wait. When the herring stopped flowing and the salt stopped coming, even kings had to negotiate. This was collective bargaining on a continental scale, the same logic that would later drive labor unions and cartels. The League negotiated as one, punishing any member who broke the block and rewarding those who held the line. The League's greatest confrontation came with Denmark. In 1361, the Danish king Waldemar Atterdag sacked Visby, the League's old trading capital on Gotland, and threatened its Baltic monopoly. The League answered with war, assembling a confederation of cities more powerful than many kingdoms. After years of conflict, the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 gave the League what no medieval state had achieved: control of the Scanian fortresses, a 15-year monopoly on the Scanian fisheries, and the right to veto the succession of the Danish throne. For a generation, the merchants of Northern Europe effectively outranked their kings. Every monopoly carries the seeds of its own decline, and the Hanseatic Leagues was no different. Through the 15th and 16th centuries, the world changed around it. New rivals rose: the Dutch, with faster and cheaper ships, and the English, with their own merchant fleets and state support. The center of gravity of European trade shifted westward, toward the Atlantic, as the great discoveries opened new oceans far from the Baltic's cold waters. And one by one, the League's privileges were stripped away. The end came gradually. In 1494, Ivan III of Russia expelled the League's merchants from Novgorod. In 1598, Elizabeth I closed the steelyard in London. The Bergen kontor lingered until the 18th century, but the League that had ruled the Baltic for 4 centuries was reduced to a memory. In 1669, the last great Hanstag met in Lübeck, the final assembly of a confederation that had never had a constitution, never had a flag, never had a common treasury. Only 3 cities troubled to appear: Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. What does the Hanseatic League teach us? 3 things, perhaps. First, that trade creates order. Merchants who share a market will eventually share a set of rules. Second, that collective action has real power. A league of cities could bargain with kings and win. And third, that no monopoly lasts forever. The same openness that made the Hansa rich made it vulnerable to anyone who could trade cheaper, faster, or freer. The Hanseatic League left no empire and no dynasty, but it left something more enduring: the idea that cities and merchants acting together could shape the economy of a continent. When you hear the phrase free trade, or watch nations negotiate over tariffs, you are hearing the distant echo of the Hansa's merchants, bargaining across the cold Baltic Sea. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of Empires and Economics, consider subscribing and join us next time as we uncover the hidden economies of the ancient world. Sources: Hanseatic Records and Lübeck City Archives. Dollinger 1970, Wubs-Mrozewicz 2013, Jahnke 2014, Treaty of Stralsund texts, Hanseatic diets, Hansatag records, kontor records of Novgorod, Bergen and London.